let's start with Jens Stoltenberg new comments on Ukraine, and he said that when the time is right, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. In your opinion, when the time would be right for Ukraine joining NATO?
Well, in fact, this question was raised many times, of course, and I think this is more a political declaration than anything else. Ukraine never met the conditions to be a full member of NATO. First of all, because of a conflict with Russia. And as long as there will be a conflict with Russia, there is no chance Ukraine can be a full member of NATO. The reason being that there's this famous Article 5, which means that if one country, one member state is attacked, all the others have to assist him. Note that the way they assist is not stated in the NATO, the charter. That means assisting may be just political, but anyhow, there is a commitment to assist, and one can assume that if there is an assistance, this can be a military assistance. In any case, this idea of Ukraine being member of NATO is revived, but it's more kind of a provocation towards Russia than anything else. In fact, I remember that Zelensky told CNN, and I think it was in March 2022, that he asked many times when he will be member of NATO, and he was told apparently by the US president at the time. But apparently he was told that he will never be member of NATO, but publicly we will continue to state that. So that's what he said to CNN. So that not explains, but it states, or it's just a demonstration that I think NATO is not really keen to have Ukraine as a member. The same applies to EU, in fact, because despite political declaration and repeated declaration that Ukraine will be member of EU, the costs. So for EU, it's a matter of cost, and the fact that you have Ukraine as a member state implies that the investment done by the other member of the EU will be enormous just to restore the functioning of Ukraine. So I think in the current situation, Ukraine can probably dream of being member of NATO and EU, but I'm not sure it will be. And in fact, what we have seen at the last summit, the last NATO summit, is that they didn't say when Ukraine would be a member. In fact, they have a plan, a membership action plan to propose for Ukraine. That means it's just an action plan. It's kind of a set of activities that needs to be done before Ukraine can be a full member. But they never stated the date for that. So, and that was noted after the NATO summit, that nobody talked about any deadline for Ukraine to be a member of NATO. As a result, I think Ukraine will be probably deluded, but they will not be member in NATO, at least in the foreseeable future. In addition to that, we have probably in the coming months, since the West is preventing Ukraine of having some kind of agreement with Russia, that means that the war will continue. And something which is underestimated in the West is the impact of the domestic politics. We know more or less what's going on the battlefield, and we see that the Russians are proceeding and they are destroying methodically the Ukrainian forces. But what we see also is that the Ukrainian forces are disintegrating, literally. I mean, people are defecting. You have full units, even to battalion size, that defect to the Russians or surrender to the Russians. You have units, even elite units like the 3rd Storm Brigade, that refuse to obey orders, meaning that you have a slow disintegration of the military system, if you want. We can talk about this later, but this is what is apparent, at least in the field. But beyond that, what we don't talk about is, of course, the whole problem in the domestic politics. One aspect of that is, of course, the difficulty of the Ukrainian armed forces to recruit people, and the new mobilization law that has just been accepted is extremely unpopular. The government asked in fact, all consular representation to deny any service to young Ukrainians who are able to serve in the armed forces. As a result, the whole thing becomes to be very unpopular and may, in fact, may probably not force young Ukrainians to come back home to fight, but probably will make those young Ukrainians to apply for a status of refugees and to remain in the West. Don't forget that most of these guys have been since 2 years in Europe. Most of them have a job. Some of them have married. They have a family now. So they have absolutely no intention whatsoever to go back to Ukraine. I have met several of these young Ukrainians because although in the Western media I'm portrayed as a pro-Russia or pro-Putin, in fact, I have been greeted by many young Ukrainians here in Brussels who, in fact, thanked me for publishing my books and making videos and things like that. But when I talked to them, I saw that these guys have absolutely no intention to go back. They're settled now in Belgium. That's where I'm living. And we don't see the slightest intention to go back. Don't forget that Ukraine, even before the war, was considered as a very corrupt country. I mean, it was not just considered, it was a corrupt country. And as a result, wages were very, very low. Everybody thought that some rich people or the government or whoever in the administration was just getting the money and the others didn't get anything. So there was no real sense that Ukraine was something that would be worth defending. And what I'm saying here, I use these words, very strong words, but I'm using words used very recently, a couple of days ago, by Alexei Arestovich. Alexei Arestovich was one of the main advisors to Zelensky. He left, or probably he had to leave, I don't know, but that was early last year. But in any case, this guy knows perfectly all the mechanisms of Ukraine, and he was close to the power. So this guy knows what he's talking about. And recently he was saying, because he was deploring the fact that, according to him, 100,000 people defected. 100,000 young guys defected. And he said one of the problem is probably that we should make our country, we should make such as this country, we failed to make this country to be defended, so that people love this country in order to defend it. And this is exactly the problem. Ukraine was probably not as the country, the state, the government, the establishment was not as popular as people think in the West. As a result, of course, we had those extreme ultra-nationalists from the western part of Ukraine, who in fact were those who carried the Maidan uprising in 2014. These were also those guys who were extremely, let's say, in favor of defending against Russia. And definitely the west of the country is extremely anti-Russia. But beyond that, we see that people, and I already mentioned, I think in your show, that in December 2021 and February 2022, the Kiev International Institute for Sociology published a poll regarding the willingness for defending Ukraine. And we could see that barely 16% of the population was ready to defend Ukraine with arms. There are a lot of people, about half of the people, the consulted people, half of them were ready to have kind of a civilian type of resistance, unarmed resistance, if you want. But only 16% were ready to do armed resistance. That shows that the willingness to defend the country is not there and is probably no longer there. Today, especially for those guys who have emigrated to the West, they have a better life here, they have better salaries, they have better wages, they have a family. So what's the point going back in a country which is half destroyed, which political elite is corrupt, and probably even more corrupt now than it was before the war? We see that more and more of these people from the establishment have got nice properties in the West, in Italy, and so on and so forth. So what's the point going and defend this country? So this is one aspect. The other aspect is that as Ukraine shrinks, and may shrink further in the next couple of weeks, you have also political move around the government, and there is repeated rumors. There are still rumors at this stage about possible coup against Zelensky, and we are in a period of uncertainty, and that makes Ukraine even less a candidate for joining NATO. The basic requirement for joining NATO, first of all, we have to remind that joining NATO is not just, as we tend to portray it in the West, a matter of declaring, I want to be part of NATO. This doesn't work like this. You have to apply for as a candidate, and then the member states will decide whether or not you can be a member. And one of the criteria of selecting or granting the status of member to a country is whether the admission into the NATO will not worsen or will not create a problem in the international security. So the impact of joining NATO will be considered by the members if they decide. We know there is a bias towards Ukraine, and there is a strong support from at least this government in the US to make more or less sure that Ukraine could be member. But there are still a lot of discussions, and you may have countries such as, for instance, Hungary, for instance. Remember that Hungary has a very small minority in the western part of Ukraine, and this minority was mistreated by the current government of Ukraine, and Hungary complained several times to the European institutions in order to have the rights and human rights of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine be respected. As a result, we see that Hungary is not convinced that the current government and the current establishment in Ukraine is a government you can trust to some extent. As a result, you may have discussion, although Hungary is not a big country, and the US is still the maestro in the NATO. So, but just say it's not granted that the whole NATO would accept that. In addition to that, you may have other NATO members, such as Spain or Portugal, who may be a little bit more critical about the membership of Ukraine. As a result, this declaration of Stoltenberg sounds to me more like a political declaration, but I'm not sure there is any impact on this. In any case, Stoltenberg, it's important to say that, is only the Secretary General of the NATO. He's not the director of NATO. So he has no power. Has no power. The power in NATO is given to the military council, and namely these are all the members of NATO, and the primus inter pares is the US. As a result, Stoltenberg is politically speaking, is a nobody. I mean, in terms of decision making, if you want, he represents the NATO, but there's no power within NATO. So this has to be kept in mind when we talk about this membership. But given the situation, and probably on the other hand, you have the Russians, they understand that the longer this conflict goes, the more there will be a problem. So they may want to probably to accelerate and make such that the political turmoil within, the domestic political turmoil may increase in Ukraine. So I'm not so confident that Ukraine will join NATO anytime soon.
You talk about the situation of the Ukrainian army, and there is an article in Financial Times. It says that Russia is preparing a major offensive in late May or June. And with the current situation of the army and this report that Russia is going to have a major offensive, and how do you see the situation on the battlefield right now?
Well, I don't know. I mean, everybody talks about this Russian offensive since last year, and in fact, we haven't seen anything. There might be some indication that the Russians are preparing for that, and it may well be possible. I mean, the Russians may probably want to give what we call it, we say in French, the coup de grâce. That means the end, the final stroke to Ukraine. And there was some indication also given by some Russian politicians. I think Medvedev said that, and probably others, like Tolstoy, he mentioned that also, that there might be an operation to recover Odessa, or I say recover because it is considered by many Russians as part of the Novorossiya. That means the old Russian empire, if you want. And we may have an operation in that direction. Nota bene, this was also what the French were pointing at when they said they would send troops in Ukraine, and they mentioned kind of a presence, a military presence in the area of Odessa. And I think this presence is probably not significant in military terms, but as probably a more political role, in the sense that the French somehow continue thinking that if they have a military presence, the Russians would not dare attacking this area. I think they make a mistake, But, that's probably the way the French wants to see that. In my view, that if the Russians have decided to take Odessa or Kharkov or whatever, it's not the foreign presence that will prevent them. So if they want to do it, they will do it, and they will probably, even as a just probably also as a kind of political gesture, they may want to destroy these foreign contingents there. So I think that may be a possibility. Now, if we talk about taking, let's say, Odessa is a big city. It's an historic city, and my personal view, I have been to Odessa when I was working for NATO, and I was in Odessa. It's a very nice city just on the sea. There's a lot of charm, if you want, this old charm of the past, so to say. And but I'm not sure the Russians would agree to fight in Odessa. I cannot imagine that a Russian would make a kind of Bakhmut in Odessa. And that's, to me, I have no idea what the Russian General Staff has in mind or in the plans, but I have some doubts that they would dare, or probably they will do differently. Probably they may surround the city and siege the city. I mean, there are probably different ways of doing that. But I don't feel that the Russians would like to fight within Odessa in this historic place. So I have no idea what the Russians want to do. But they will probably, what they will certainly do is to grind down and to continue grinding down the Ukrainian forces, because everything they are doing now I mean, Avdiivka and all that, this is nice and fine. But what we have to understand through that is that it reduces the military capabilities of Ukraine, meaning that even if the battlefield is only in the Donbass area, but if the Ukrainian army is totally absorbed in that conflict and eventually get destroyed in that area, there will be no other forces to defend cities like Kharkov or Odessa. So that might be the calculus of the Russians, to deplete the Ukraine. They have done that with the anti-missile, anti-aircraft defense. They have done that with the armored force. They have done that with the more or less artillery. So they may continue that and deplete all the infantry. And that may come soon, since you have so many people defecting or surrendering or just deserting. So we may have, at the end of the day, an Ukrainian army which is so weak that then you can afford to go into large city, because then there will be no assets anymore to defend those cities. That might be the calculus of the Russians. I have no idea. But what is certain is that the Russians will continue to destroy every single piece of this army. And that will certainly then create even more problem for the political leadership. And we may have a country that crumbles from the inside, in fact. And that's probably what the Russians are expecting, that with the destruction, with this and you have some kind of panic that we can see within the Ukrainian leadership, that I mentioned the new mobilization law that tries to keep the interests from the West, and that's the reason why they keep saying that after Ukraine you may have war extending to Poland, so on and so forth. But I think this is the problem. Ukrainians, they are now in panic. They don't know how to mobilize forces, not to mobilize, yes, resources. That means forces, but also financial support. We have seen this psychodrama with $61 billion from the US, and we see that out of the 61 billion, you have barely 12 or 13 billion that will end up in new equipment to Ukraine. And we have seen that this equipment will be depleted extremely rapidly. In addition to that, on the opposite side, the Russians learn very fast. And we had a very interesting interview from Maria Berlinskova, who is coordinator for the Ukrainian Air Force, a coordinator for equipment and things like that. And she said in the interview that the equipment provided by the West was not functioning, that it is not adapted for the war the Ukraine is waging, meaning that besides the fact that you don't have much equipment coming to Ukraine, this equipment is not adapted for the war. We have seen the whole question of the M1 Abrams that were withdrawn from the front line because they are not suited for the kind of warfare that the Ukrainians are waging. And here it's important to underline, many people say there are not enough equipment. We should provide more equipment. But the problem is not the quantity of the equipment. You know, if you look, we have talked about Gaza. If you look at Gaza, the Palestinians are just fighting very effectively the Israeli, which has the largest army of the Middle East, the most technologically advanced army in the Middle East. And the Palestinians, with their own equipment and even homemade weapons, are able to resist effectively against. So, but the difference is, and that's the interesting lesson. The problem is not the type of weapon you have, the quantity of weapon you have. The problem is, again, well, I've mentioned that several times, but people tend not to understand. An army, an effective army or defense system is precisely a system. And if you have an army, even with a weak weapon, if you want, but if these weapons are used effectively in the consistent doctrine with people who are trained for using that particular equipment in a particular environment, so that you have at the end of a fighting system, then it works. Remember, the Viet Cong managed also to win against the most technological advanced army of the world, which was at the time the US. So the problem is not the quantity or the quality of the weapon, is how these weapons are integrated in a fighting system. And that's exactly what Ukrainians have not managed to do. They received weapons, they used them, but they used them totally disconnected from any doctrinal system. They never managed to integrate all the equipment they received into a consistent command and control system, doctrinal system, and to use them effectively. I've mentioned that several times, but for instance, when they use, you know, they have received Leopard 2 tanks. The Leopard 2 is a wonderful weapon. I mean, I was a commander of a Leopard 2 battalion. It's a fantastic weapon, but the problem is that you have to use adequately. And if you are not able to use it adequately, it's better not using it. But the Ukrainians managed to use it in an environment that was absolutely a command and control environment that was absolutely not suited for that. As a result, they ended up using those tanks like that as a moving bunkers, if you want. So it's just a moving piece of artillery. This is not the way a tank is supposed to act. It has to be used much more dynamically. And the Ukrainians, for many reasons, they were never able to do that. As a result, you can bring any weapon you want. this will never, each system should support another system. If you take your army or your defense system as one system, every system is complementary. You cannot just use one system once and another system another time. All of them should be integrated in one concept. And the failing to do that by the Ukrainians is exactly what is fatal. And that gives, at the same time, that gives the Russians the opportunity to build up countermeasures for all the equipment they have. And as a result, we see today that even the most sophisticated equipment we provide to the Ukrainians are just countered by the Russians' EW, or electronic warfare measures. So we see that the Ukrainians engaged this war in 2022. I said that because they prepared for a war against Donbass since 2021, and they started this war thinking that this was last just for a few days or maybe weeks. That's all. And they considered, or they assessed, that the Russians would never be in a position to have enough time to counter them effectively before sanctions would have an effect on the economy and eventually the political system. As a result, the Ukrainians were never prepared themselves for a sustained war against Russia. And today they are trapped in their own trap, so to say. And this is exactly what we have. So we may have other funds coming later from the European Union or whoever, or new tanks to buy new equipment and so on and so forth. We may have that. We may have F-16. They may come probably earlier than next year, as people tend to say. I don't know where they will come, but they will probably come. The problem is that, again, you have a brand new equipment that is not integrated into a single, consistent command and control structure. As a result, I anticipate that this will not solve the problem. It will just help the Russians to grind down the Ukrainian army up to the last Ukrainian, exactly as Senator Lindsey Graham used to say. They will fight until up to the last Ukrainian. It's exactly what the Russians will do. So this is unfortunately where we are heading to. And if we do so, I think probably we may see, as I said before, a political collapse even before the military collapse. And that political collapse may then define a completely new situation. First of all, we may have a new government that may probably consider that we should end the conflict and find a solution with the Russians, come back probably to the proposal Zelensky made in March 2022, and probably adjust some of the features of this treaty to adjust to the current situation. I don't know. I have no idea. But we may have that, and that may completely change the equation. And therefore, the idea of Ukraine being a member of NATO may totally change, or maybe just become fantasy, total fantasy. So that's a little bit the situation if we extrapolate a little bit from what we see on the ground.